Welcome to Noon Wednesday. I'm Marissa Wojcik, multimedia journalist with Here and Now on PBS Wisconsin. Today is August 25. As Afghan refugees begin to arrive at Fort McCoy, many are remembering the past when the only other large-scale refugee relocation effort occurred. In 1980, some 15,000 Cubans came to the Western Wisconsin military installation. Joining us to talk about this history is Omar Granados, an associate professor of Latin American and Latino studies at UW-La Crosse, who has been studying the 1980 Cuban refugees for many years. And Omar, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
I just want to start, can you walk us through just what the first few days or weeks were like for the Cubans as they were arriving at Fort McCoy?
Right. So the 1980 exodus of Cuban refugees to Wisconsin, and not only Wisconsin, but other military bases that were created by the Carter administration at that time, were mostly characterized by chaos. There was, the speed at which the exodus happened out of Cuba in April of 1980, in a period of barely 3 months, you had over 125,000 Cuban migrants just sailing across the Florida Straits and landing in Key West. The Carter administration just had no resources at the time to deal with that massive exodus. So the folks that came specifically to Fort McCoy were the folks that were in the later legs of that exodus, and there were people that had not identified relatives in the United States or friends that could act as sponsors. Fort McCoy was also the last resettlement center, which was the name given to the military bases. There was one in Arkansas, there was one in Pennsylvania, and one in Florida, northern Florida. The Fort McCoy welcomed the last group of refugees, and this group was, mostly formed by single Black men between the ages of 25 and 35 years old, who had joined this exodus under very different conditions of whether they had wanted to join or not, and folks that also had just been pushed out of Cuba by the Cuban government to come in that exodus. They had no idea where Wisconsin was. They had no idea where they were going. Everything was very disorganized and uncertain for that group of people at Fort McCoy, which ended up being over 14,000 Cuban refugees total in the summer of 1980. So from May 30th to late September, a total of 14,300 refugees approximately went through Fort McCoy.
And you mentioned uncertainty. So from your research and conversations with some of these men, can you describe what it's like for someone experiencing this, to be leaving their home and coming to a completely foreign country?
It's the history of the United States and Cuba itself has it's very peculiar. It goes back for hundreds of years. So it's impossible to say that these people didn't have an idea what the United States was like, or what the promise of the American dream was like. grown up in Cuba, even during the socialist period in Cuba. The United States is very present in the imaginary of Cuba, cultural, political. Um, but for me, it's always difficult to try to explain to Cubans, the immensity of the United States geography. People think that the United States and Cuba, people think that the United States is Miami and South Florida. So for these folk who are, as I like to call them, and island folk, imagine what it was like to just land in the middle of Wisconsin, where every day of their lives was just getting colder and colder and colder, and they didn't even know what was coming after that. So geographically, they were displaced. Culturally, obviously, they were tremendously displaced. These were folk that had experienced traumatic separation from their families, traumatic separation from their social, circles. Many of them had been politically persecuted in Cuba. Many of them were in the gay community and had been ostracized and persecuted by the Cuban government. Many of them were folks that had religious affiliations that were not permitted by the Cuban government at the time. And many of them, especially the young people that came, had been in some sort of trouble with the law for crimes that were considered dangerous at the time to the socialist state of the Cuban Revolution, but were mostly minor misdemeanor crimes like trade in the black market, illegal gambling, homosexuality and prostitution and things that because of the ideology presented by the Cuban government as the sole way of understanding society were seen as dangerous to the state. So those folk had, there's a large number of young men that also had refused to join the Cuban army or the Communist Party and had also been put in prison, even for a temporary period of 10 months, who were sent to the Mariel Exodus from those cells without even having the opportunity to say goodbye to their families or knowing where they were going. So there was, both the promise of a new life, the hope of the American dream, rebuilding that dream of the Cuban American community in South Florida, but also all the traumatic experience of leaving Cuba without really wanting to. For many of them, it's important to recognize that the Mariel Exodus is the first time in the history of Cuban migrations to the United States where people are forced to leave Cuba. A large number of people are actually forced to leave Cuba by the government. So it's an important differentiation that I always like to make, when I talk about Cuban migration to the United States.
And so when you talk about how the idea of the U.S. Might have been largely kind of the Florida, Miami area, the cultural and language barriers of coming to Wisconsin, Western Wisconsin, was even greater.
Absolutely. The difference that we see today between the first wave of migrants in the Mariel Exodus, the people that came in the first 3 weeks of the Exodus, and the people that came after is significant. And that was mostly a result of the way in which those who arrived in Key West and benefited from the work of voluntary organizations that were already waiting for them in Key West. Those were mostly families and people who had relatives in the United States. About 29% of that group had family in the United States, and for them the transition was very easy into, the Cuban social and economic networks of Miami and Tampa and other Cuban settlements. But about 70% of that group, even when they did not have that family, they were able to resettle very fast into the Miami area and integrate into the social fabric of Miami and the workforce. More importantly, because of how prevalent Spanish was and the knowledge of immigration and legal services that Cuban American community already had in regards to what those folk needed to do to get their paperwork in order. Now, if you are a Black immigrant, a Black migrant who lands in Wisconsin, who doesn't know Spanish, your fate is going to be very different. The voluntary organizations that are helping out in Wisconsin have very limited knowledge of the legal processes that were necessary for these folk to come out of the base. They had very limited resources in terms of language, Spanish interpreters, the people that were doing the translations, the legal translations of documents, the people that were doing interpreting as all the refugees were coming in and basically intaking this key information that is going to decide the fate and life of this person for the next 50 years, were high school students. Wisconsin high school students with their teachers were volunteers that could speak some Spanish. And that created many, many errors and many, many problems for folk that we still see today are struggling to get their paperwork in order because of those errors that were made at Fort McCoy. That's one aspect of it. The rush to settle or resettle that group of refugees out of the fort also brought about the mismatch, as I like to say, of refugees with sponsors. People wanted to help. People in Wisconsin volunteered, churches, families volunteered, but FEMA and the U.S. government, which at the time were coordinating, all these efforts, didn't really inform these families carefully. Didn't really, give all the information necessary of how these refugees should have followed up on their immigration proceedings in order to get the specific forms and don't miss any deadlines. And in all honesty, many of these refugees never wanted to stay in Wisconsin after that. So we had many cases where these folk were, finding a sponsor. And we can talk about that process a little bit later if you want, how it was that you could find a sponsor if you didn't have any family. But as soon as they left the base, they would just jump in a bus and try to go to Miami or New Jersey or New York, where bigger groups of Cuban immigrants were already settled.
So, like 1980, today there are so many Afghan people coming in such a short amount of time, and the disorganized haste can cause short-term and long-term detriments based on some of the things that you just described. Do you foresee that potentially happening with the current Afghan refugees that are now flowing very quickly into the United States?
I mean, and it's a very different situation. It's a very different group of migrants with very different cultural, background, and a different idea of the United States, and a different uh, experience in regard of what their lives has been during the last 40 years in Afghanistan. I think um, Afghan refugees might have a very different perception of the United States in terms of the relationship that they had with the United States, which has been a very militarized relationship. That's one aspect. When the Cuban immigration happened, it was, mostly a result of a Cold War scenario where these 125,000 people were unfortunately the victims of, the political wars between Cuba and the United States. This is a very different scenario. These folks are living a war zone under very real threats of violence, and I think that's the most important part in terms of considering who this group is, what are the specific needs of this group, the women, the families, the unaccompanied minors that might come in that group. Obviously, their religious orientation is going to play a significant role in how these refugees are welcomed into the United States. The language is going to present even a more significant barrier, than when we think about Spanish and the way in which Spanish is spoken in the United States today. It's not going to be that easy to find interpreters and translators for this population. There's a lot of women that have experienced trauma and abuse, and that has also it's a very important requirement of how we manage this exodus in terms of qualified personnel. But in my opinion, there's always this rush to go help and provide food and shelter. I think actually listening in and trying to emphasize with the group and trying to understand what the actual needs of the group are might be a more beneficial way. Just kind of taking a pause and thinking about what are the actual needs of this population in terms of not just food and shelter, but beyond the trauma that they're experiencing at the time, and the repercussions that trauma is going to have as they try to actually resettle into U.S. communities. It's tremendously important that we understand really the suffering and not just think about food, shelter, job, and education. So oftentimes in the history of refugee migration, that is the aspect that gets lost in the rush. That is the aspect that gets lost in the human, trauma that is attached to having to leave your everything behind and land in a place that you just don't know at all. So that's my opinion. I know it's it's a very complicated issue, but that's the first thing that I think about when, as a refugee myself.
So now you touched on this a little bit, but archives and old news reports talked about how Castro emptied out his prisons, and these Cuban men were mostly criminals, and how people at first in the La Crosse area were very welcoming, but then it turned to mistrust. Now, would you say that that's accurate, that so many of them were criminals? And can media have a detrimental impact on our perceptions? And what kind of media literacy should we think about for today's Afghan refugees coming to the U.S.?
That's a really, really important question to think about the role of the media in all this. When we think about what happened in 1980 with the Cuban population, one of the biggest pitfalls of that was precisely the role played by national U.S. media and Western Wisconsin local media in terms of reporting, the exodus and the arrival of the Cubans. No, it's been researched and documented today that about only 7% of that population that came the Mariel Exodus had criminal records of considered seriousness, and many of those people had been in jail for reasons that wouldn't qualify as a crime in the United States. Now, all that information was lost in the translation, to say it in a way. One of the steps that and I imagine that this will be the same for Afghan refugees. One of the steps of coming out of Fort McCoy was an interview with the INS, an interview with the FBI, where this person would be asked, are you a member of the Communist Party? Yes, of course. There was no way to not be a member of the Communist Party in Cuba, because that would put you in a either in jail or in a position where you and your family would be socially ostracized, and your kids at school would be put through shame just because you'd say no to that. So to an FBI agent saying, well, this person is a member of the Communist Party, so there's a clear misunderstanding there. And I really hope that 41 years later, we've come to be better than that. Things like stealing food or selling stuff in the black market were categorized as state, endangering activities by the Cuban government. And many of these people that came in the exodus, in the Cuban exodus, because they wanted to leave Cuba, they actually lied about their homosexuality, they lied about their criminal records, just so they could be sent to the Mariel exodus because they wanted to leave anyways. So they would say, yes, I'm a homosexual, when they weren't really. But the records that the U.S. government were receiving, if at all, from Cuba, were completely inaccurate, and very confusing, to use a kind word for U.S. authorities. Now, once the press, the Cuban press actually was the body that started that narrative about this is the scum of society, of Cuban society, that we don't want. We're sending them out. These are the people that are the enemies of the revolution. There's a famous Fidel Castro speech saying, we don't want him, we don't need him, let him go, let the scum go. That was never dismantled by the American press. In fact, it was solidified. It was magnified with scenes of mostly black men, displaying violent behavior, images of the camps. There was a famous riot at Fort Chaffee early that summer that was completely taken out of proportion by the New York Times. So if you're a family in Wisconsin and you're thinking about welcoming, opening your home, and you have children to a refugee from Cuba, and you're reading this in the news, and you're reading that there are stabbings and that there the sexual violence against minors within the fort, which there was. What do you think is going to happen when you put 14,000 people cramped in a space without knowing where they're going or what their fate is going to be? Of course, violence is inevitable to a certain degree, but at the same time, there were a lot of other positive things that were happening in the base that the press totally ignored. There was a lot of detail and nuance to this population, the composition of this population, that the press, the Wisconsin press ignored. In 1983, you have the movie Scarface, which becomes perhaps the most violent the film of the 80s. There's now an icon of American culture, featuring precisely a Mariel refugee as this mega pin of cocaine, in Miami, and this just completely violent and ruthless, the displaced individual who actually turns this image of the immigrant gangster as a family man. That you don't have the Godfather eating dinner with his family anymore. All of a sudden, you have this Latino, individual who doesn't like family, he's just all by himself, and he's the baddest guy in the planet. So that transformed that idea of who the Mariel subject is in the American public. There's a large group of Haitians coming in at the time through Miami and South Florida as well. So the press is also somewhat mixing and overlapping those racial imaginaries of Haitians and Cubans. Up to that point, everything that the American public knows about a Cuban is, I love Lucy. And that guy is pretty white, and he's a musician, and he's a kind, nice guy, a family man. Now the press is discussing Cubans and Haitians as in the same group of migrants, merging those racial imaginaries and completely presenting them in a negative light to the American public. So that was very, very detrimental to the way in which this group of Cubans experienced resettlement in areas like La Crosse, Toma, Sparta, where at that time having 200 Black men walking around the streets of La Crosse, going to bars where the same college students or biker gangs were going, wasn't gonna end up well. So indeed, many of these folks were ended up in trouble with the law, and many of those confrontations with neighbors or cases of bar fights were actually started by white Wisconsin residents. But what you have in the record is the many court cases that were for Cuban refugees, in particular in La Crosse County.
So, based on the extensive knowledge that you have of 1980 and what we understand, only a fraction of the Cubans that came to Wisconsin, came to Fort McCoy, actually ended up resettling. What is the best way to support this huge population of Afghan refugees, whether they're going to be here temporarily or they're going to settle permanently? And what did we get wrong in 1980 that we have the opportunity to get right today?
Right. So I think a big problem in 1980 was educating this population on the actual steps, not only the refugees, but the sponsors, whether it is an organization, whether it is a family. I think one of the biggest, errors at the time was that FEMA, which was handling day-to-day operations at Fort McCoy, along with the U.S. Army, of course, basically released this refugee to an organization and a family, and never actually require them to follow up, never actually require them to go through any sort of training to what's next. Again, just assuming that that person is going to be okay with food and shelter, it's not enough. I mean, this is particularly in the case of somebody who doesn't speak English. There has to be ESL, language access for them. I think language access is, it's probably one of the most important things. Today, we have a population of about 40 Mariel refugees who still live in the La Crosse area, and that have tremendous difficulties with English, tremendous difficulties with any sort of social or legal service, just because they never got it right from the beginning. So educating the families that are going to welcome these folk, if they do indeed stay in the area, which is unknown at this time, educating the organizations in terms of like what actual steps are necessary for these people to get their refugee and asylum status in the period of time that is required by the immigration laws. What sort of support do they need in terms of education, not just getting any job, but actually having access to higher education, having access to the funds from the state to be able to participate equally in an equitable way, rather than just say, okay, they're fine, they're with a family, they're going to be okay. So I think that was one of the biggest problems at the time. I think another big mistake that was made was, again, as we just discussed, the way in which the press approached the Exodus. There's always the government officials and anybody that has to respond to their constituents or their viewership is always very careful in the way they discuss or present an issue, because they obviously don't want to lose the support of that population. I think it's important to remember that there's a human aspect to welcoming refugees that needs to put that, beyond any sort of, duty or responsibility that you have to your audience or your, and educating the population. There's these population, I think, actually has many more similarities with the Hmong refugees that resettled in La Crosse during the 70s than the group that came from Cuba, because of I'm guessing that these will be more families. This will be more women because of the situation in Afghanistan, as opposed to the group that came from Cuba, which were mostly single men. There's a lot of education that needs to happen um, at places like University of Wisconsin campuses. There's a lot of work that students and faculty can do. A lot of organizations that can, it's not just up to religious groups to come out and help. I think anything that the press can do to educate on the situation on Afghanistan, apart from the role of the United States Army and the failure of the Biden administration and anything like that, just the history of that trauma, showing people what it's like to grow up in a country that has been at war for 40 years. Americans, we think about war as something that takes place elsewhere. It's very hard for us to imagine we have war at home. So I think just, with my students, sometimes I tell them, what do you guys want to talk about this semester? Anything, climate change, feminism, this and that. War is never an issue that comes up. And I'm like, you've been at war since you were born. The only issue is that it hasn't happened at home. So it's hard for you to visualize and imagine what it's like to think about, somebody who was born and grew up in a country at war. So, I plan to talk about with my students about that this semester, just to get them started on that way of thinking. Thinking about the other in terms of a mirror of yourself. So there's a lot of education to be done, especially up here, where Islamophobia and racism are so visible, in our communities.
Well, we need to leave it there. Omar Granados, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge of this history and experience. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
For more from Here and Now in PBS Wisconsin, you can visit pbswisconsin.org/news. And thank you so much for joining us on Noon Wednesday.